At 7:23 a.m. on February 18, 1966, Lance Corporal Michael Chen stepped over a clump of elephant grass 12 miles southwest of Da Nang, his M14 rifle sweeping the tree line 40 yards ahead. The morning sun burned through the mist rising from the rice paddies. Behind him, Third Platoon, Alpha Company, 1st Battalion, 9th Marines, spread out in a loose patrol formation, 19 men moving through terrain that looked empty but never was. Chen's boot came down on ground that felt solid. The earth didn't give way beneath him, no explosion, no pungy stakes, just solid ground. He took another step, then another. The bullet hit him in the back of the head before he heard the shot. The crack of the AK-47 came after, echoing across the paddy. Chen dropped face first into the mud. His rifle splashed into standing water. The Marines behind him hit the deck, weapons up, searching for the shooter. They saw nothing. No muzzle flash, no movement, just empty rice paddies and distant palm trees. Then the ground 12 feet to Chen's left erupted. A circular piece of earth, 18 inches across, lifted on hidden hinges. A Vietnamese fighter rose from the hole like a ghost, materializing from the earth itself. He fired 3 more rounds into the prone Marines, dropped back into the hole, and pulled the camouflaged lid closed behind him. The entire event took 4 seconds. By the time Corporal James Harper reached the spot where the shooter had been, there was nothing. Just grass and mud and a circle of earth that looked like it had never been disturbed. Harper knelt down, pushed his fingers into the soil, found the edge of the lid. He pulled it open. Below was darkness. A vertical shaft, maybe 6 feet deep, then what looked like a tunnel branching off horizontally. He could smell cigarette smoke and the faint odor of fish sauce. The shooter was gone. Somewhere under their feet, moving through passages they couldn't see, heading toward an exit they didn't know existed. Chen died before the medevac helicopter arrived. He was 22 years old, from San Francisco, a draftee who'd been in country for 73 days. The Marines called in artillery on the area. They pumped tear gas into every hole they found. They threw grenades down shafts that seemed to go nowhere. Nothing came back out. That night, after they'd returned to base, Harper asked their platoon sergeant what the hell they were supposed to do about fighters who could shoot you and then disappear into the ground. The sergeant, a veteran of 2 tours, had no answer. The Marine Corps Field Manual had 16 pages on patrol tactics and ambush avoidance. It said nothing about enemies who lived underground. The term spider hole came from the American Civil War, where it meant a hastily dug foxhole. By World War II, the Japanese had perfected the concept on Pacific islands like Iwo Jima and Leyte. They called them takotsubo, octopus pots, after the clay vessels fishermen used to trap octopi. A soldier would dig a vertical shaft just wide enough for 1 man, deep enough to stand in. He'd cover the top with a camouflaged lid made from branches, grass, and packed earth. When enemy troops passed overhead, he'd stay hidden. When the moment was right, he'd lift the lid, fire, and disappear. It was a suicide tactic. Once you emerged, you were committed. Most Japanese soldiers in spider holes died, but they took American Marines with them. The tactic worked because it exploited a fundamental truth about human perception. People don't look at the ground beneath their feet. They scan the horizon. They watch the tree line. They search for threats at eye level or above. They don't expect the earth itself to open up and shoot them. By 1966, the Viet Cong had taken the Japanese concept and evolved it. They didn't use spider holes for suicide stands. They connected them to tunnels. A fighter could pop up, engage, and retreat underground. moving through passages to emerge somewhere else, or he could stay hidden while American troops walked directly over him, then shoot them from behind. The spider hole became part of a larger underground network that stretched for hundreds of miles beneath South Vietnam. The Cu Chi tunnel system alone covered 75 miles. It included hospitals, ammunition depots, sleeping quarters, and command centers. Spider holes served as both fighting positions and entry points. They were everywhere, and they were invisible. The Viet Cong built spider holes with deliberate precision. The fighter would start by selecting terrain. Rice paddies were ideal because the water table was high and the ground stayed soft enough to dig, but firm enough not to collapse. Jungle clearings worked too, especially near trails where American patrols moved predictably. The hole itself was circular, 18 to 24 inches in diameter, just wide enough for a man to stand with his shoulders brushing the walls. The depth varied. Some were 4 feet deep, enough to crouch below ground level. Others went 6 to 8 feet down, allowing the fighter to stand fully upright, with only his head emerging when the lid opened. At the bottom, a horizontal tunnel branched off. This was critical. The tunnel gave the fighter an escape route. Some connected to larger tunnel complexes. Others were simple passages that ran 20 or 30 feet before emerging in another spider hole. The lid was an engineering achievement in itself. The fighter would construct a frame from bamboo, light but strong. Over this he'd pack earth and vegetation that matched the surrounding terrain. In a rice paddy, that meant mud and grass. In the jungle, leaves and fallen branches. The hinge was made from leather or flexible bamboo, positioned so the lid would open upward and inward, giving the fighter maximum cover while he fired. Some lids included a small observation hole, allowing the fighter to watch without opening the lid. Others had breathing tubes made from bamboo, extending up through the earth, disguised as reeds or grass stalks. The camouflage was so effective that American soldiers could step within inches of a spider hole and never see it. Aerial reconnaissance was useless. The holes were too small and too well hidden. Even ground troops conducting careful searches often missed them. Clay pots were sometimes used as liners for the holes. A fighter would lower a large ceramic vessel into the shaft, then stand inside it. The pot protected against moisture and provided structural support. It also insulated the fighter from the earth, making long stays more bearable. If the pot broke, the fighter might find himself sharing his space with scorpions, centipedes, or bamboo pit vipers. That was an accepted risk. Between January 1966 and December 1968, spider holes accounted for an estimated 11% of American casualties from ambush attacks. The numbers were difficult to track, precisely because after-action reports often described the attacks as sniper fire from unknown positions. But the pattern was consistent. A patrol would move through an area. Shots would come from close range, often from behind. Marines or soldiers would return fire. The enemy would vanish. No blood trails, no bodies, no evidence anyone had been there. Private First Class David Morrison, 3rd Battalion, 3rd Marines, survived a spider hole attack on March 4, 1967, near Chu Lai. His squad was moving through a village that had been declared secure. They'd swept it twice. No contact. No signs of enemy activity. Morrison was 4th in the patrol column. He heard the shot and felt something tug at his sleeve. The round had missed his arm by an inch. He hit the ground, rolled toward a low wall, brought his M16 up. The squad opened fire at nothing. Then someone shouted that there was movement behind them. Morrison turned. 15 feet back along the path they'd just walked, a section of ground was lifting. A fighter emerged waist-high from the earth, AK-47 shouldered and firing. He put 3 rounds into the Marine at the rear of the column before disappearing back into the hole. The entire engagement lasted 7 seconds. Morrison and 2 others rushed the position. They threw grenades into the hole. They heard them explode underground. They poured rifle fire down the shaft. When they finally lowered someone down on a rope, they found a tunnel extending horizontally in both directions. No bodies, no weapons, just darkness and the smell of explosive residue. The fighter had escaped through a passage they couldn't follow. Spider hole tactics evolved throughout the war. In early 1966, most spider holes were simple fighting positions. A single fighter would hide, engage, and either escape or die. By 1967, the Viet Cong were using them as part of coordinated ambushes. One fighter would pop up to draw fire and reveal American positions. While the patrol focused on that threat, other fighters would emerge from spider holes to the flanks or rear, creating a crossfire. The Americans had no effective counter-tactic. Standard procedure was to maintain formation dispersal so one spider hole couldn't engage multiple soldiers at once. But dispersal made the patrol more vulnerable to conventional ambushes. Close formation meant spider holes could hit multiple targets. There was no good option. Some units tried to assign rear security, soldiers whose job was to watch behind the patrol. This helped, but only marginally. Spider holes could be anywhere. A soldier watching his rear quadrant might walk directly over a hole in front of him. The Viet Cong learned to wait until the rear guard passed, then emerge and shoot the middle of the column. Fire discipline was emphasized. Don't waste ammunition on unseen targets. But when a spider hole attack happened, fire discipline disappeared. Marines would dump entire magazines at empty ground because they didn't know where the threat was. The sound of gunfire echoed. Muzzle flashes reflected off water in rice paddies. Everything became chaos. That was the psychological objective. Spider holes didn't need to kill many Americans to be effective. They created fear, exhaustion, and paranoia. Every step became dangerous. Every patrol through seemingly empty terrain carried the knowledge that the earth itself might attack. This took a toll on morale that casualty statistics couldn't measure. The tunnel rats emerged as a response to the spider hole problem, though their primary mission was to explore and destroy the larger tunnel complexes. These were soldiers, usually smaller in stature, who volunteered to go underground into Viet Cong tunnels, armed only with a flashlight, a pistol, and a knife. The job was as dangerous as any in Vietnam. Harold Roper, a tunnel rat in 1968, later described it as the most fear he'd ever experienced. The tunnels were built in zigzag patterns to limit blast damage from explosives and restrict lines of sight. A tunnel rat would crawl forward in complete darkness, unable to see more than a few feet ahead. Around every corner could be a booby trap, a snake, or a Viet Cong fighter waiting in ambush. Spider holes complicated the tunnel rat's job because they served as both entry and exit points. A tunnel rat might enter a tunnel complex through one hole and find himself facing a Viet Cong fighter who'd just descended from a spider hole after engaging American troops on the surface. These underground encounters happened in near total darkness, in spaces so tight that both men could barely move. They were usually fatal for one or both combatants. The tunnel rats developed their own tactics. They learned to listen for breathing, for the sound of movement in the darkness ahead. They learned to recognize the smell of different explosives, of human presence, of Vietnamese cooking. They carried CS gas grenades to flush out enemies without having to engage in the tunnels. They moved slowly, methodically, checking every surface for tripwires. Between 1966 and 1969, there were only about 100 Army tunnel rats in Vietnam. Most were wounded at least once. Many died, either in the tunnels or in surface ambushes, but they eliminated over 12,000 Viet Cong fighters and captured thousands more. They found weapons caches, ammunition stores, intelligence documents, maps, and entire underground hospitals. One tunnel rat discovered a missing M48 tank that the Viet Cong had been using as a command center. Another uncovered a signals intelligence operation that had been intercepting and decoding every transmission from 2 American infantry divisions, the tunnel rats and their Australian counterparts. The tunnel ferrets provided the only real counter to the spider hole network, but there were never enough of them, and the tunnels were too extensive. For every tunnel complex discovered and destroyed, 3 more remained hidden. Operation Crimp, launched on January 8, 1966, was the first large-scale American encounter with the integrated tunnel and spider hole network. The operation involved the U.S. 1st Battalion, 503rd Infantry Regiment of the 173rd Airborne Brigade, along with Australian forces from the 1st Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment. The objective was to sweep an area near Cu Chi that intelligence indicated was a Viet Cong headquarters. 8,000 American and Australian troops were deployed. They expected to find enemy forces and engage them in conventional combat. Instead, they walked into an area honeycombed with tunnels and spider holes. The Viet Cong had known they were coming. Village informants and spotters had tracked the American buildup. By the time the operation launched, most Viet Cong fighters had withdrawn into the tunnels. They waited underground while American troops established positions on the surface. Then, after nightfall, they began to emerge. Spider holes opened across the American perimeter. Fighters would pop up, fire a few rounds, and disappear. The Americans returned fire, but they were shooting at ghosts. Sentries reported movement, but when illumination flares went up, they saw nothing. Then another spider hole would open 20 yards away, and the process would repeat. The Australians were the first to understand what was happening. Captain Sandy McGregor of the 3rd Field Troop ordered his engineers to search exhaustively for tunnel entrances. They found ammunition, radio equipment, medical supplies, and clear evidence of extensive underground habitation. McGregor's men entered the tunnels and began mapping them. They discovered a complex that ran for miles with multiple levels, blast doors, and defensive positions. One of McGregor's soldiers, Corporal Robert Botel, died when he became trapped in a dead-end tunnel. The Viet Cong had deliberately constructed false passages that led nowhere, designed to trap and kill anyone exploring the tunnel system. Despite the grim discovery, McGregor pressed on. His findings revealed for the first time the military significance of the tunnels. At an international press conference in Saigon, McGregor referred to his men as tunnel ferrets. An American journalist who'd never heard of ferrets used the term tunnel rat instead. The name stuck. The psychological impact of spider holes on American troops was profound and difficult to quantify. Unlike conventional ambushes or firefights, spider hole attacks created a specific kind of fear. The ground beneath your feet became untrustworthy. Every step through a rice paddy or jungle trail carried the possibility that the earth would open and someone would shoot you before you could react. This wasn't paranoia. It was a rational response to a documented threat, but it was exhausting. Soldiers on patrol couldn't maintain the level of alertness required to watch for spider holes while also watching for conventional threats. You couldn't scan the horizon and watch the ground simultaneously. You couldn't maintain fire discipline while worrying that the enemy was directly beneath you. The result was a constant low-level stress that accumulated over weeks and months. Sleep became difficult even in supposedly secure base areas. Soldiers would lie awake wondering if there were spider holes inside the wire, if the Viet Cong were underneath their positions right now, listening, waiting. This wasn't irrational. There were documented cases of Viet Cong emerging from spider holes inside American base perimeters. Some units developed rituals to cope with the spider hole threat. They'd fire into the ground randomly while on patrol, hoping to hit a hidden fighter, or at least make noise that would warn anyone underground that they were coming. This wasted ammunition and accomplished little, but it gave the soldiers a sense of agency. Other units would refuse to patrol through certain areas known to have extensive tunnel networks. They'd call in airstrikes or artillery instead, even when the tactical situation didn't warrant it. Commanders understood why, and usually approved the requests. The alternative was sending men into terrain, where they'd be looking over their shoulders and watching the ground at their feet for 8 hours straight. That kind of stress led to mistakes, and mistakes got people killed. Medical evacuations for combat stress and psychological trauma increased significantly in areas where spider hole attacks were common. Medics reported soldiers who couldn't stop talking about the ground, who would freeze up during patrols when they felt the earth shift beneath their feet, who would wake up screaming about being buried alive. The official U.S. Army response to spider holes evolved slowly. Initial field manuals said nothing about underground threats. Patrol procedures assumed the enemy would be visible, either hidden in conventional cover or moving through the terrain. The concept of an enemy who could materialize from beneath your feet wasn't addressed. By late 1966, after Operation Crimp and numerous smaller engagements, the Army began updating its tactical guidance. New patrol procedures emphasized dispersion to minimize casualties from any single spider hole attack. Rear security was made mandatory. Soldiers were instructed to watch for subtle signs of spider holes, disturbed earth, vegetation that didn't match its surroundings, small holes that might be breathing tubes. These measures helped marginally. The reality was that well-constructed spider holes were essentially undetectable to moving patrols. The Army also began deploying mine detectors, thinking they might pick up metal from weapons inside spider holes. This failed because many Viet Cong fighters used ceramic pots instead of metal-lined holes, and the weapons themselves were often positioned horizontally in the connected tunnels, too far from the surface to detect. Some units tried using dogs trained to detect human scent. The dogs were somewhat effective at finding spider holes, but the Viet Cong adapted by masking their scent with fish sauce, mud, or by remaining perfectly still until the dog and its handler had passed. The most effective countermeasure proved to be time and patience. Units that moved slowly, carefully searching terrain before advancing, found more spider holes. But slow movement created other vulnerabilities. A patrol moving at a crawl became an easier target for conventional ambushes or mortar attacks. There was no perfect solution. Combat engineers developed specialized equipment for clearing tunnel complexes, acetylene torches to burn out the oxygen, CS gas to make the tunnels uninhabitable, explosives to collapse passages. The Mighty Mite, a small portable blower, pumped tear gas and smoke into tunnel entrances. These methods destroyed some tunnel complexes, but the networks were too extensive. For every tunnel system that was cleared, 3 remained operational. By 1967, the Viet Cong were incorporating spider holes into sophisticated defensive networks. Around major tunnel complexes like Q-Chi and the Iron Triangle, spider holes were positioned in overlapping fields of fire. An American unit advancing through the area would be engaged from multiple spider holes simultaneously, creating crossfires that made it impossible to find cover. Combined with conventional bunkers, trench lines, and booby traps, these defensive positions were extraordinarily difficult to assault. The battle for Hill 861, near Khe Sanh in April 1967, demonstrated this integration. Marines advancing up the hill found themselves under fire from spider holes that connected to tunnels running throughout the hill mass. Clearing one position meant nothing because fighters could move underground to another position and continue the engagement. The Marines eventually took the hill, but casualties were heavy. 84 Marines were killed over 3 days of fighting, many from spider hole attacks they never saw coming. Spider holes were also used offensively during large-scale attacks. In the Tet Offensive of 1968, Viet Cong sappers used spider holes to infiltrate American positions. They'd hide underground near American bases for days, emerging only at night to move closer. When the offensive began, they'd pop up inside or near American positions, creating chaos behind the defensive lines. This tactic was particularly effective in urban areas during the fighting for Hue and Saigon. Spider holes in bombed-out buildings or under rubble allowed Viet Cong fighters to appear and disappear seemingly at will. American forces conducting house-to-house fighting had to check not just rooms and rooftops, but also basements and ground-level spaces for spider holes connected to tunnel networks beneath the city. The statistics tell part of the story, though they're incomplete. Between 1965 and 1973, American forces in Vietnam suffered 58,220 combat deaths. Of these, approximately 11% came from ambush attacks, where the source of fire was not identified or where enemy forces disappeared without leaving evidence of their presence. Not all of these were spider hole attacks, but a significant portion were. Spider holes and booby traps together accounted for roughly 15% of American wounds and 11% of deaths. These percentages seem small until you consider the total numbers. 15% of 58,000 is over 8,000 deaths. 11% is over 6,000, and those are just fatalities. Wounded soldiers numbered over 300,000. 15% of that figure is 45,000 wounded. Many of these wounds were catastrophic. Spider hole attacks typically happened at close range, 10 to 30 feet. AK-47 rounds at that distance caused massive tissue damage. Survival rates were lower than for wounds from longer-range engagements because the rounds retained more energy on impact. The psychological casualties don't appear in these statistics. There's no official count of soldiers who developed what we now call PTSD specifically from spider hole encounters, but anecdotal evidence from veterans suggests the impact was significant. Many Vietnam veterans report that their most vivid memories of the war involve not the major battles, but the small, terrifying moments when the ground opened up and someone tried to kill them from a hole they'd walked past moments before. The long-term military legacy of spider holes is complex. American forces never developed a fully effective counter to the tactic. The war ended not because the U.S. military defeated the Viet Cong underground network, but because political will to continue fighting collapsed. The tunnels remained largely intact through 1973. When North Vietnamese forces overran South Vietnam in 1975, they used some of the same tunnel complexes that had sheltered the Viet Cong a decade earlier. modern military doctrine acknowledges spider holes as a continuing threat in guerrilla warfare. Training exercises at Fort Benning and Camp Pendleton include scenarios involving fighters emerging from concealed positions. Special operations forces train extensively on urban and rural underground operations. The spider hole concept has appeared in conflicts from Iraq to Afghanistan. In 2003, American forces captured Saddam Hussein hiding in what was characterized as a spider hole outside Tikrit. The term had entered the military lexicon permanently. The Cu Chi tunnels are now a tourist attraction. Vietnamese government guides lead visitors through enlarged portions of the tunnel system, explaining how the Viet Cong lived and fought underground. The spider holes have been preserved, though they've been widened to accommodate Western tourists who are generally larger than the Vietnamese fighters who originally used them. The narrative presented at Cu Chi emphasizes Vietnamese ingenuity and determination. It frames the tunnels and spider holes as symbols of resistance against a technologically superior enemy. This is accurate as far as it goes. The Viet Cong did demonstrate remarkable innovation in developing and using underground warfare tactics. What the tourist narrative omits is the human cost. The conditions in the tunnels were horrific. Viet Cong fighters lived underground for months at a time with minimal food, water, or ventilation. Disease was rampant. Malaria, dysentery, and various parasitic infections killed more Viet Cong than American weapons did. Many fighters who survived the war died young from illnesses contracted during their time underground. The men who fought against spider holes carry the memory differently. For American veterans, spider holes represent a specific type of fear that doesn't translate easily to civilians. It's the fear of the ground itself becoming hostile, of solid earth revealing itself to be a lie. It's the knowledge that you can do everything right, follow every procedure, maintain perfect situational awareness, and still die because someone you never saw emerged from beneath your feet and shot you in the back. There's no honor in that kind of death, no tactical lesson, no sense that you could have done something differently. You were just in the wrong place when the earth opened up. Some veterans won't walk through fields or forests anymore. They stick to pavement and concrete, surfaces they can trust. Others compulsively check the ground wherever they go, looking for subtle signs of disturbance that might indicate hidden dangers. These behaviors seem irrational until you understand where they come from. When you've seen a friend die because the earth opened up and killed him, the ground stops feeling solid. Lance Corporal Michael Chen, who died on February 18, 1966, was one of approximately 6,000 Americans killed by spider hole attacks during the Vietnam War. His name is on Panel 7 East, Line 93 of the Ia Ba Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. Most visitors to the memorial don't know how he died. They see his name among 58,000 others and understand only that he died in combat. The specific circumstances, the spider hole that opened behind him, the fighter who emerged and disappeared in 4 seconds, those details are lost to everyone except the men who were there. Corporal James Harper, who tried to pursue the shooter into the tunnel and found only darkness, survived the war. He returned to Pennsylvania in 1967 and worked construction for 40 years. He never talked about Vietnam except once a year, on February 18th, when he'd call the Chen family in San Francisco and speak to Michael's mother. She died in 1989. After that, Harper would visit the memorial on February 18th each year and stand in front of Panel 7 East. He died in 2014 at age 70. His obituary made no mention of Vietnam or spider holes or the day his friend was killed by the ground itself. The Viet Cong perfected a form of warfare that exploited human psychology and terrain in equal measure. Spider holes weren't just fighting positions. They were a statement about the nature of the conflict. In a war where American forces had overwhelming firepower, superior technology, and seemingly unlimited resources, the Viet Cong proved that none of that mattered if you could become invisible. An enemy who could hide beneath the earth, emerge to kill and disappear again, was an enemy who couldn't be defeated by conventional means. The spider hole was the perfect symbol for the entire Vietnam War. It represented an enemy who refused to fight by rules that favored American strengths. It created casualties not through superior firepower, but through patience, ingenuity, and the willingness to endure conditions that would break most soldiers. It turned the very ground into a weapon. And it worked. Not because it killed vast numbers of Americans, though it did kill thousands, but because it created a level of psychological stress that made every patrol, every advance, every step through Vietnamese countryside an act of courage. The ground beneath your feet might be solid earth, or it might be the lid of a spider hole. You wouldn't know until someone emerged and started shooting. That uncertainty, maintained over months and years, eroded morale more effectively than any conventional military campaign could have. By 1968, many American units would refuse to patrol through areas known to have extensive tunnel networks. They'd call in airstrikes instead. They'd burn the villages. They'd destroy the countryside with bombs and chemical defoliants. Anything to avoid having to walk through terrain where the earth itself was hostile. This response accomplished little tactically. The Viet Cong rebuilt. The tunnels remained. The spider holes continued to kill Americans until the last U.S. combat units withdrew in 1973. The ultimate assessment of spider holes as a military tactic depends on how you measure success. In terms of American casualties inflicted relative to resources expended, spider holes were extraordinarily efficient. The cost to build one was minimal. A few hours of labor, some bamboo, mud, and grass for camouflage. No weapons beyond what the fighter already carried. Yet each spider hole represented a threat that could tie up an entire American patrol, force them to slow their advance, call in support, and expend ammunition and explosives trying to clear an enemy who'd already escaped. Multiply that across thousands of spider holes throughout South Vietnam, and the cumulative effect was significant. American operations were delayed, disrupted, or canceled because of the spider hole threat. Units that should have been advancing were instead conducting careful, time-consuming searches of terrain. Artillery and airstrikes were used to destroy areas that might contain tunnels and spider holes, wasting ordnance that could have been used against concrete military targets. From a broader strategic perspective, spider holes contributed to the erosion of American public support for the war. News reports of soldiers being killed by invisible enemies who appeared and disappeared like ghosts reinforced the narrative that Vietnam was an unwinnable conflict. How do you defeat an enemy who lives underground, who can strike from beneath your feet, who vanishes before you can return fire? The question had no good answer, and that absence of answers contributed to the growing sense that American involvement in Vietnam was futile. Whether the Viet Cong leadership planned for spider holes to have this strategic effect is unclear. More likely, they were simply using every available tactic to kill Americans and survive. But the cumulative psychological impact of spider holes exceeded their direct military value. They became symbols of an enemy who couldn't be defeated by conventional means, who would endure conditions that would break most soldiers, who would sacrifice everything to win. The men who emerged from spider holes to fight were not ideological warriors fighting for abstract principles. Most were farmers and villagers who'd been drafted into the Viet Cong or who'd joined because American bombing had destroyed their homes. They fought in spider holes because that was the tactic they were trained to use, and because it gave them a chance to survive engagements with an enemy who had overwhelming firepower. The conditions were miserable. Hours spent cramped in a hole barely wider than your shoulders, standing in water that seeped up from the ground, breathing air that smelled of earth and rot. Mosquitoes and leeches were constant. Rats would sometimes enter the holes. Snakes were common. A spider hole fighter would wait in these conditions for hours or days, listening to American patrols passing overhead, waiting for the moment when the tactical situation was right to emerge and engage. The psychological stress of this was immense. You're hidden underground, alone, unable to see what's happening above. You hear footsteps, voices, the sound of equipment. You know there are armed men directly above you who will kill you if they find your position. But you also know that your orders are to wait, to let them pass if the situation isn't right, to emerge only when you can strike effectively and escape. The discipline required to remain hidden while American soldiers walked overhead, sometimes within inches of your position, was extraordinary. Many fighters couldn't maintain it. They'd emerge too early or at the wrong moment and were killed. Those who survived learned patience that bordered on the inhuman. They learned to control their breathing, to remain absolutely still, to exist in a state of suspended readiness for hours at a time. This required a kind of courage that doesn't fit conventional military narratives. It wasn't the courage to charge into fire or hold a position against overwhelming odds. It was the courage to remain buried in the earth, alone in darkness, waiting for the moment that might never come, or that might result in your death seconds after you act. The spider hole tactic was eventually abandoned, not because it became ineffective, but because the war ended. American forces withdrew in 1973. The North Vietnamese conventional invasion that conquered South Vietnam in 1975 had no use for spider holes. Tanks and artillery don't hide in the ground. They advance on roads and engage in open battle. The tunnels were abandoned. Many spider holes were filled in or simply left to collapse. Some remain. If you walk through the countryside near Cu Chi today, you can still find depressions in the ground that mark where spider holes once were. The land has reclaimed them. Bamboo and grass grow over the spots where men once hid and emerged to kill and die. The ground looks solid and peaceful. The only indication that anything happened there is the slight irregularity in the earth's surface, a circle 18 inches across where the ground settled after the tunnel beneath collapsed. But the memory remains for those who were there. American veterans of Vietnam carry the knowledge of spider holes with them. It's not something they talk about often. When they do, they describe it in terms that emphasize the impossibility of the situation. How do you fight an enemy you can't see? How do you trust the ground beneath your feet? How do you maintain morale when you know that any step might bring death from below? There are no good answers to these questions. The spider hole tactic exploited a fundamental vulnerability in conventional military operations. Patrols have to move. They can't search every square foot of ground before advancing. They can't eliminate every possible threat before proceeding. They have to accept risk and move forward. The Viet Cong understood this and designed a tactic that made that necessary risk unbearable. The cost was their own lives, often, and the horror of living underground in conditions that broke many fighters before the Americans ever found them. But it worked. Spider holes didn't win the war. No single tactic did. But they contributed to the cumulative effect that made American victory impossible. They killed thousands of American soldiers. They wounded tens of thousands more. They created psychological trauma that veterans carried for the rest of their lives. And they demonstrated that in guerrilla warfare, the side with the technological advantage doesn't necessarily win. Sometimes the side that can endure more suffering, that can turn the earth itself into a weapon, that can wait in darkness for days to kill a single enemy, sometimes that side wins simply by not losing. That was the lesson of spider holes. That was the lesson of Vietnam. If you found this story compelling, please like this video. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Thank you for keeping these stories alive.